going on, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So I know I usually start the show with depressing news, but the latest story to come out of the Justice Department is a true tragedy. Attorney General Eric Holder is resigning after nearly 6 years on the job. Now, Holder did make history as the nation's first black attorney general and made some headway with regards to drug sentencing reform, but that's about where the accolades end. See, this is a man who's pretty much always sided with the status quo when it comes to the most pressing issues facing this country. Holder, who previously represented scandal-plagued bank UBC as a private attorney, said this about prosecuting financial institutions back in May. Now, sometimes a company's conduct may be wrong, may be hard to defend, but not necessarily be violative of the criminal law, or sometimes there may be an appearance of criminal wrongdoing that cannot be supported by evidence that would be admitted in a court of law. Despite the jargon, a too-big-to-jail guy through and through. Or take his vigorous defense of U.S. drone strikes, where he claimed that not only are drone strikes against American citizens abroad perfectly legal, but that the Obama administration could technically kill an American citizen by drone on U.S. soil under extraordinary circumstances. Or his unrelenting and unprecedented prosecution of whistleblowers and journalists, like New York Times reporter James Risen. In fact, Holder's used the archaic Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers more than any other administration, all other administrations combined, actually. Or who could forget his promise in 2009 to end DEA raids on medical marijuana dispensaries, only to oversee dozens of them across the country in the following years. So don't forget to shed a tear for Eric today. The establishment couldn't be more grateful for your service. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
It's UN week in New York City, and despite the plethora of problems facing the world, no other issue has garnered more attention at the 69th UN General Assembly than Islamic extremism. Just last night, the UN Security Council unanimously passed a resolution to ban the citizens of member states from supporting the Islamic State. Of course, not all world leaders are on board with policies that seek a military solution to eradicating extremism. In fact, unity doesn't seem to be the theme at this year's global gathering. World leaders seem more focused on finger-pointing and pontificating than actual problem-solving. So to go over a few highlights of the UNGA thus far, I'm joined now by RT correspondent Alexei Yarochevsky from New York. Alexei, one thing that's been more criticized at the UNGA is the continued existence of the Security Council itself. Who's the most vocal critic of this, and why do they think it's so problematic to the body as a whole?
Well, I think the most vocal critic of the UN and the UN Security Council in particular is the people in the streets of New York who have been protesting. I mean, ever since I came here to work in New York, I've been witnessing one protest after another, and almost at every protest, people have been saying how ineffective they believe the UN was. But if we talk about the world leaders who have been talking from the rostrum of the UN headquarters here in New York, probably the most vocal critic is Dilma Rousseff, the Brazilian president, who has called for systematic UN reforms. She says that developing countries must have their say, particularly at the UN Security Council. Another critic is another Latin American president, the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who said that, in fact, the biggest plague threatening the world at the moment is the outbreak of Ebola disease. And while the UN should be focusing on that, and while the UN Security Council should be dealing with this pressing matter, it is involved in deciding whether or not more countries should be bombed. The other Latin American president, the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, who was here at our RT studio just a few days ago, is also a skeptic of the UN Security Council as it is, largely pointing to its ineffectiveness in solving the pressing matters of the world today.
And the main focus, of course, is about ISIS, like you just said. How can we bomb this group more? How divided are world leaders, and what approach the international community should take in dealing with the group?
Well, after a rather emotional speech by President Obama, not everyone actually agrees with it, and some are actually making analogies with the Bush rhetoric of that era. Still, the opinions of the world leaders on how the world should be dealing with ISIS are different. Everyone acknowledges and everyone pretty much agrees that the threat of terrorism needs to be dealt with. It's the methods and origins of this problem where there are some differences. For instance, while the Western countries are either agreeing or silently agreeing with what Obama had to say, the presidents of, again, Venezuela, of several other Latin American countries, and the president of Iran are describing this as a campfire which the Western countries are trying to extinguish with fuel, meaning that bombing the territories of Syria, of Iraq, and other countries where ISIS is located would not solve the problem, it would only aggravate it. And they suggest that the problem should be solved by the regional powers. So the world is pretty much split on that, and countries which I've mentioned, and also Russia, which is saying that it's not right to bomb a country surpassing the UN mandate. These countries are opposing the idea of military intervention as it is.
Right, and we also saw Iranian President Hassan Rouhani speak out against this, kind of saying that the bumbling there in the Middle East has caused this, and we shouldn't look to those powers to solve the problem. Thank you so much, Alexei, for being on the ground there and giving us the updates. An emergency session of the independently organized Russell Tribunal in Palestine held its closing statements today in Brussels, Belgium. The symbolic jury consists of international peace activists, politicians, and diplomats who deliberated over Israel's latest offensive in Gaza, dubbed Operation Protective Edge. The findings comprise a laundry list of war crimes, including everything from the intentional targeting of civilians to the disproportionate use of force and the use of violence to spread terror among people. In a statement, the tribunal added that, quote, "It is recognized that in a situation where patterns of crimes against humanity are perpetuated with impunity and where direct and public incitement to genocide is manifest throughout society, it is very conceivable that individuals or the state may choose to exploit the conditions in order to perpetuate the crime of genocide." Well, earlier I was joined by one of the organizers of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, Frank Barat, and I first asked him to clarify that statement.
We decided, actually, due to the incredible violence and the incredible sort of disproportionality of the Israeli attack, to even look at the potential crime of genocide. The jury didn't come to the conclusion that a genocide did take place during Operation Protective Edge, but nonetheless, we talked about incitement to genocide, which is a very dangerous process. You know, when a society like the Israeli society right now talks about the Palestinian, or actually the Arabs, the way they call them, as less than human, you know, and when it's not actually coming from, you know, various folks, it's coming from, it is coming from various people, but including, you know, very high-level politicians like the Israeli member of the Knesset, what's her name again, Ayelet Shaked, who actually said, you know, the entire Palestinian people is the enemy, and we should actually kill the mothers of the future children. It's coming from policemen. It's coming from the media. So this incitement to genocide reminded us of the Rwanda case, where, you know, when people started to, you know, ring the alarm, saying like something very bad's going to happen, the international community didn't react at all. I mean, international community, I'm talking about Western states. We are actually saying genocide didn't happen this time, but the fact that this incitement for genocide takes place in all levels of Israeli society is a very dangerous thing. And if we don't do anything now, if we don't stop this now, we could eventually come up, maybe in the next attack or the next aggression, to something much, much, much bigger. Just a last thing, I mean, there's a very important figure during, like numbers, during Operation Cast Lead, 50 tons of munitions were dropped on Gaza, 50 tons. During this last operation, it was 700 tons. So it's huge. I mean, in terms of the disproportionality, it's a huge raise, and we we sort of we're pretty much calling the world to so we're putting the world on notice, and we're telling them we should do something now before it's too late.
Let's talk about the corporate actors and also just the third-party actors here. Of course, Israel can't do this alone. What did the tribunal find in terms of corporate entities that are complicit in Israel's war crimes?
I mean, the tribunal actually had a session in London in 2010 that focused exclusively on corporate complicity in Israeli occupation. Once again, I mean, 99% of the munition that are actually dropped on Gaza are made in the US. So, I mean, the complicity there from corporation making these weapons is clear-cut. But a lot of other corporations, like the G4S, a British-Danish security company, the biggest security company in the world, is actually manning, the settlements, and is actually providing the security service at settlements. He's providing staff as well around settlements. There are actually corporations like Motorola, like a lot of people have mobile phones from Motorola, that is also involved in providing technologies again to settlements, to CCTV cameras around settlements. So we start from the bottom line that if the settlements are illegal, and if you provide a service to an illegal entity, you're actually helping and abetting the illegality of this colony. So a lot of, I mean, there was like 12 corporations in the dock in London in 2010, including Veolia as well, the French corporations, and they've got a duty. I mean, most corporations now, they want to be green and they want to be ethical. So most of them actually do have an ethical charter that we need to pin this upon them, because they do not respect it at all.
And although there are recognized members of the UN as well as prominent human rights officials testifying there, Frank, the findings are largely symbolic. How do we turn this sentiment into meaningful action to hold Israel and its complicit third parties like the US and these corporations that you just outlined accountable?
Yeah, I mean, that's the tough question. But, like some people call the Russell Tribunal or the Popular Tribunal a mock tribunal. But what I often tell them is, like, if we are a mock tribunal, what about the International Court of Justice, which in 2004 condemned the construction of the wall in the occupied territories as illegal? This was not a mock court, right? It's the highest judicial body in the world. This opinion was not respected by anyone, by Israel, by any of the third parties, including states, including the UN. So I think the problem with Israel is not like having a mock tribunal or having a proper court, if you want, if you want to call it this way. It's actually the level of impunity that Israel has been enjoying for many, many years. No other states that violate international on a sort of daily basis will be received in the US like with the red carpet, and in the UK with the red carpet. This is really what we in the civil society can pinpoint to people that are not engaged in the struggle yet. That is, for me, a global struggle, because we can see that sort of the reproduction of the occupation and the tools that Israel uses in Palestine and in the West Bank and in Gaza are then used in Ferguson, to control crowds. I mean, they're used in various places around the world. So it's a very global struggle. And as a civil society, we need to. I mean, we've seen so many people in the streets in the last few months after and during Operation Protective Edge. So I think that the thing is we are at a peak, I think, in terms of like Palestinian solidarity around the world, or pro-justice solidarity around the world. And the bottom line is how to make sure we sustain this and transform it and sort of turn it into a real global movement. I think that's a key issue for any activist around.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, of course. Thank you so much for your work, Frank Barat, coordinator of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine.
Thanks, Eddie.
Coming up, I'll highlight some of the most egregious police brutality cases recently caught on tape. Stay tuned.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
Considering that there's no federal policy mandating cops wear cameras, police brutality against civilians often goes unrecorded, meaning that eyewitness testimony is all that we have to rely on when it comes to documenting these cases. Look no further than Ferguson and Michael Brown, where video evidence could have put all doubts about what really happened on that fateful day to rest. But luckily, some of these incidents are caught on camera. Over the past few days, several disturbing, incontrovertible videos documenting police force have emerged, painting a grim picture of the relationship between the public and those who serve and protect. Starting in Beaver Creek, Ohio, where surveillance footage showing the police killing of 22-year-old African-American man John Crawford at a Walmart was finally released. Here he is. Here's Crawford carrying a toy rifle for sale at the store around the aisles while he talks on his cell phone. But not once does he point the gun at customers, which was originally claimed by the man who called 911. When the police come into the store and see Crawford, his side is turned to them, and he's instantly shot with zero chance of surrender. Now, tragically, despite the fact that the video completely contradicts the police's claim that they warned him with multiple times to put down the gun, a grand jury decided not to indict any of the officers involved. After the jury's decision, the lawyer for Crawford's family said, quote, "It makes absolutely no sense that an unarmed 22-year-old man would be killed doing what any American citizen does every day, shopping at a Walmart store." The Crawford family is extremely disappointed, disgusted, and confused. They're heartbroken that justice was not done in the tragic death of their only son. And as inexplicable as the shooting is, what happened to another black man, LeVar Jones, at a gas station in South Carolina earlier this month is equally, if not more, abhorrent.
Answer your license, please. Get out of the car! Get out of the car! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
I just got my license. You taking my license? I got my license right there. That's my license right there.
Put your hands behind your back. 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 Put your hands behind your back.
What did I do, sir?
Yes, apparently even totally complying with the cops' instructions can get you bum rushed and shot multiple times these days if you're committing the crime of being black. Now, luckily, Jones was shot in the hip and survived the shooting, but the speed in which a simple traffic stop almost turned deadly is indicative of the systemic racism embedded in police forces across America. Unlike most police shootings, justice does have a chance to be served in this case, as the officer involved, Sean Grobert, has been charged with aggravated assault and battery and faces up to 20 years in prison. However, the same cannot be said for a sickening event that took place last weekend in the police state capital of the U.S., New York City.
Don't resist, don't resist, don't resist, throw your hands up.
Yes, that was Sandra A. Mezquita, a 5'4" woman who's visibly 5 months pregnant, being thrown to the ground belly first by the NYPD. And then another woman who goes up to check out the incident is also violently pushed to the ground. See, according to the watchdog group El Grito de Sunset Park, the police were in the middle of beating and arresting Mezquita's son for possession of a knife he had clipped to his belt. When Mezquita tried to get the cops to stop beating her son, they forced her to the ground. Mezquita's husband, Ronel Lemos, said, quote, "The first thing I thought was they killed my baby, and they're going to kill my wife." Thankfully, the baby's fine, but Mezquita suffered vaginal bleeding, bruises, and pain in her abdomen as a result. And just in case that wasn't enough of a gift from the NYPD, she also received a summons for disorderly conduct. Listen, the sad thing about all these stories is that despite the video evidence, only one case resulted in actual consequences for the officers committing these criminal actions. But at the very least, the more times this brutality is recorded and shared with the public, the less that officers can claim that they're using necessary force because they fear for their lives. Because in reality, it's us that should fear for ours. If you watch the corporate media at all today, you might have thought that America was under attack. See, for several hours, outlets from CNN to Fox reported that according to the new Iraqi prime minister, there was an imminent terror threat to the subway systems in New York City and Paris. Well, it turns out that if any of these news outlets bothered to check the information with the intelligence agency, they would have found the entire report to be false. But this is just the latest example of how the corporate media keeps Americans in a perpetual state of fear. So here to discuss the media coverage of ISIS and the new war in Syria, I'm joined now by nationally syndicated radio host Lionel. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
So, Lionel, why do you think the MSM continuously fearmongers us about impending doom if there's literally no factual basis for the threats?
Oh, Abby, facts, facts, facts. There you go with your facts again. This is about scaring the hell out of people. This is about keeping people constantly in fear. It's been called the Hegelian dialectic, to create a problem, thus causing the people to turn to the government and say, help me, help me. And then the government says, okay, we'll help you, but we may get a tad draconian. Draco be damned. Do it. And it follows. Because nobody in the media, Abby, ever asked the question, is this substantiated? Where did you get this from? No worry, just go with it. And then next, things in your bathroom that can kill you, and a duck and a viral video playing the piano. That's our media.
You just summed it up in a nutshell right there. And of course, speaking of this incessant fear-mongering, according to Haaretz, recruitment has soared for ISIS. It's like pouring water on gremlins. Since the U.S. bombing campaign began, over 6,000 fighters have flocked to join the ranks. Do you think it has anything to do with the media's incessant coverage of the group, Lionel?
You know, it's amazing. We should use some of these recruiters here for unemployment problems. See the world. Join ISIS. Now, is it ISIS, IS, AQI? Is it ISIS, ISIL? These sounds like characters from Yentl, ISIL. I'm doing a Jackie Mason here. Now, Daesh, which is a pejorative crafted by the French, and now courtesan, 50 of them? I can't keep track of this. So bring it on, I guess.
Yeah, I can't keep track of it either. I was just going to say, not only are they saying that there's this fifth group, the Khorasan group, they pose a bigger threat than ISIS, Lionel. Who knew? I mean, geez, there's like 5 different splinter groups now.
But there's 50. And don't forget about ISIL. ISIL wasn't a problem when they were beheading Christians and raping women, but as soon as they got near Erbil in Kurdistan, well, now we're going to do something about that. You see, everything was fine until they went after that darn oil. That changed the calculus of the situation.
Well, speaking of beheading, we know about all the human rights abusing Gulf nations that are joining the U.S. in these airstrikes, Lionel, including Saudi Arabia. Just this morning, Prince Turki Al Faisal was on CBS saying that there needs to be boots on the ground in Syria immediately. Why the hell are we turning to an Islamic extremist state that beheads people for sorcery to help fight Islamic extremism?
I saw this morning, and I don't expect anybody from CBS or Donald or anybody to give him a hard time, but I just wish I would have said, just like they do on Fox News sometimes, they'll say, what do you have to say to those individuals who might suggest that you were actually the paymaster, you and Qatar and British and American intel in camps in Jordan, basically funding these people when they were called the FSA. And in fact, isn't the FSA really ISIS or IS reconstituted? Now, I don't expect Turkey to actually say, yeah, you got me, Nora. Doggone it. Here I was thinking this would be easy, and you nailed me. I don't expect him to do a mea culpa, but at least pretend you care versus some type of a travel log for the State Department. Act like you're a bit inquisitive and a tad skeptical.
Right. Travel to Saudi Arabia. It's like a big see the world. Go to Saudi Arabia. Go do sorcery there. Let's move on to race, Lionel. Of course, there's so many horrific instances of police violence against African Americans. Shocking. I have to bring up this clip between Bill O'Reilly and Brit Hume on Fox after Hume hosted an all-white panel talking about racism in America. Let's take a listen.
When they say you're a racist, is there any thought behind it, or
no? Well, a typical one is it was 4 white people discussing this, and therefore it was racist.
Okay.
In other words, in order to discuss this, you have to either have an African American president, but if you're just white, then discussing this is racist.
So I don't think Brit really gets it there. Why having an all-white panel talking about racism might be problematic, Lionel.
Abby, nobody said this was going to be a fair and balanced discussion on racism. Look, if we do a discussion on obesity, if we don't have a fat person, does that make it unfair? No. Brit's got a point, kinda.
Well, at the same time, 3/4 of African Americans, 2/3 of Hispanics distrust the media, according to the Media Insight Project. Beyond Fox's absurdity, why do you think they feel so unrepresented on the media spectrum?
I don't know. Maybe they misunderstood this. Don't they understand that race doesn't matter here? Just the fact in that awful clip of all of these African Americans basically being plowed down and mowed down, I guess, for being black. What would ever give the African American contingent of this country the idea that perhaps maybe that might be, oh, I don't know, targeted? Pshaw.
Let's move on to the big event this week, the UNGA, where Obama said 3 of the greatest threats facing the world: Ebola, Russian aggression, and ISIS. What's missing here, Lionel, other than the CIA?
Cooties. Cooties, maybe. No, I don't know. First of all, Ebola. Is there a connection there? Ebola. And I'm glad he brought up the fact about Russia. I'm very concerned about Ukraine. I'm very concerned about the next casus belli. I'm very concerned about nuclear proliferation, about a real, actual, palpable, tenable situation with names I can pronounce that don't transmogrify daily. But what was the solution? He identified the problems very, very well. What are we going to do about it? Wait a minute. Leo DiCaprio spoke about that, didn't he? Wasn't he marching for a while after he flew in? It was about climate or something. You know, Leo, by the way, is an expert on anthropogenic causation models. There we have it. Again, a 5-second media clip and followed by things in your bathroom that can kill you.
Right.
So
it's all relative, Lionel.
Matter.
You know, I remember listening to you on Sirius XM. The fact that this one, quote, leftist radio station couldn't even stay alive. What does that tell you about the myth of the predominantly liberal media that supposedly reigns supreme in this country, Lionel?
Not only is it a myth, but the left-right paradigm is a myth. The idea that there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans. You know, Abby, what you and I love is the truth. That great philosopher, Arthur Conan Doyle, said, when you remove all that is impossible, the remains, even though they're improbable, tends to be the truth. I am fearless in my dedication for the truth. And if you think the professional left or the professional right has any interest in the truth versus this narrow casting versus broadcasting, this myopic worldview, you're out of your mind. There is no left media. There is no right media. There is just basically the antipodal, the syzygy, the opposites, basically two sides of the same coin.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you
emphatically.
so much for coming on. Lionel, media decoder, radio host, all of the above. Thanks so much, Lionel.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again. The issue has garnered more attention at the 69th UN General Assembly than Islamic extremism. Just last night, the UN Security Council unanimously passed a resolution to ban the citizens of member states from supporting the Islamic State. Of course, not all world leaders are on board with policies that seek a military solution to eradicating extremism. In fact, unity doesn't seem to be the theme at this year's global gathering. World leaders seem more focused on finger-pointing and pontificating than actual problem-solving. So to go over a few highlights of the UNGA thus far, I'm joined now by RT correspondent Alexei Ochevsky from New York. Alexei, one thing that's been more criticized at the UNGA is the continued existence of the Security Council itself. Who's the most vocal critic of this, and why do they think it's so problematic to the body as a whole? May be hard to defend, but not necessarily be violative of the criminal law, or sometimes there may be an appearance of criminal wrongdoing that cannot be supported by evidence that would be admitted in a court of law. Despite the jargon, a too-big-to-jail guy through and through. Or take his vigorous defense of U.S. drone strikes, where he claimed that not only are drone strikes against American citizens abroad perfectly legal, but that the Obama administration could technically kill an American citizen by drone on U.S. soil under extraordinary circumstances. Or his unrelenting and unprecedented prosecution of whistleblowers and journalists, like New York Times reporter James Risen. In fact, holders use the archaic Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers more than any other administration, all other administrations combined, actually. Or who could forget his promise in 2009 to end DEA raids on medical marijuana dispensaries, only to oversee dozens of them across the country in the following years? So don't forget to shed a tear for Eric today. The establishment couldn't be more grateful for your service. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking set.
It's UN week in New York City, and despite the plethora of problems facing the world, no other issue.
Well, I think the most vocal critic of the UN and the UN Security Council in particular is the people in the streets of New York who have been protesting. I mean, ever since I came here to work in New York, I've been witnessing one protest after another, and almost at every protest, people have been saying how ineffective they believe the UN was. But if we talk about the world leaders who have been talking from the rostrum of the UN headquarters here in New York, probably the most vocal critic is Dilma Rousseff, the Brazilian president, who has called for systematic UN reforms. She says that developing countries must have their say, particularly at the UN Security Council. Another critic is another Latin American president, the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who said that, in fact, the biggest plague threatening the world at the moment is the outbreak of Ebola disease. And while
What's going on, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So I know I usually start the show with depressing news, but the latest story to come out of the Justice Department is a true tragedy. Attorney General Eric Holder is resigning after nearly 6 years on the job. Now, Holder did make history as the nation's first black attorney general and made some headway with regards to drug sentencing reform, but that's about where the accolades end. See, this is a man who's pretty much always sided with the status quo when it comes to the most pressing issues facing this country. Holder, who previously represented scandal-plagued bank UBC as a private attorney, said this about prosecuting financial institutions back in May. Now, sometimes a company's conduct may be wrong.